Hello everyone, it's Crystal. Thank you for joining me today for part 2 of the Library Quilt Quilt-along. Today we will focus on sewing the blocks. In this video, I will show you how to sew your colored strips to your white strips, how to press your seams, how to set them, and then how to press them towards the dark side, and how to sew a sample block. You can have fewer strips than I have. You can have more strips than I have. The purpose of this quilt-along is to use your creativity. We are not tethered to a pattern. Feel free to use your imagination however much you want to use it. Once again, this is part 2 of the Library Quilt-along. Please share photos of your progress on Instagram and use the hashtag Library Quilt QAL. Once again, the hashtag is Library Quilt QAL. Let's get started. So I'm going to take a colored strip and a white strip. These strips are 4.5 inches wide. I'm going to show you how I'm going to sew these strips together, because when the strips are done, the white strip will be on top, because the white strip is the background for my quilt. So I'm going to put my colored strip on the bottom, normal, and my white strip on top. And I'm going to line up this short edge right here. Normally when you sew pretty sides together. So this is the pretty side for my colored strip. The white strip is solid, so both sides are the same. There's no pretty side, there's no ugly side. I shortened my stitch length to 2.0 millimeters, and I'm going to do what's called chain piecing. But for the first set of strips, I'm going to just show you how it will look when you're done. Cut my thread, lift my presser foot. So this is how your strip will look when we are done. So you do that for all of your strips. So I'm going to show you what chain piecing looks like. So I have another colored strip here. And I'm going to put another white strip on top. Remember, my color strips are different lengths, but all of my white strips are 7 inches long. So lower my presser foot, lower my needle, and sew. So I do not cut my thread. Then I add another colored strip, then another white strip, line it up, and just to let you know, my presser foot has a guide right here, so I can have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I can lift my presser foot, line up my fabric with the guide, and sew. Stop, grab another fabric, colored fabric, grab another white fabric, lift my presser foot, line up my fabric with the guide, and sew. So once I am done with all of my strips, once again, I'm doing 2.5 inch strips, 3 inch strips, 3.5 inch strips, 4 inch strips, and 4.5 inch strips. So far I have a total of 272 colored strips and 272 white strips. I may not use all of those strips in my quilt. Your quilt does not have to be that big. And any remaining blocks I have, once I'm done, I may make a pillow, I may make a table runner. I'm not sure, but I cut the fabric I wanted to use. I counted the pieces, and then I cut white fabric strips to correspond with the colored fabric strips. After I'm done piecing all of my colored strips to my white strips, we will go to the ironing board and I will show you how to press the seams. After you sew the colored strip to the white strip, this is what you will have. You'll take your iron and you'll just press the seam to set it. There's a difference between pressing and ironing. Pressing is when you lift, move the iron, and put it back down. Ironing is when you go back and forth and in a circle. So we are pressing, not ironing. So we take our iron, place it on our seam. Then we open up. We're going to press our seam allowance towards the dark fabric. So the easiest way to do that is to always have your dark fabric on top. Take your iron and press towards the dark. It'll be nice and flat, and this is what you will get. And you will do that for all of your strips, however many you decided to cut and to sew together. Once again, the easiest thing to do is to have your colored fabric on top and you press towards the dark fabric. Because when you sew your strips together, you won't be able to see the seam allowance because it will be in the dark. And one more time. Take your strips, place your colored fabric on top, get your iron, put it down on the seam. Open up your two strips. Place your iron on the seam, and the seam allowance is towards the dark. And you will do that for all of your fabric strips. The next thing we will do is sew our strips together to make our block. So after we have all of our strips pressed open, the seams pressed to the dark, then we are ready to sew our strips together into our different blocks. So the easiest thing to do is to lay out each block. You can lay out all the blocks before you start sewing, or do each block separately. I tend to do each block separately. So this is what I will do. I will take some strips. This is my book. The colored part is my book. The white part is my background fabric. So take some various strips, lay them out on this is a rotating cutting mat. Lay them out and see how I want them to be sewn together. My finished block size will be 12 and my finished block will be 12, but I'm going to sew and square it up with my 12.5-inch ruler. So say for instance, I wanted this to be my block. I would take this setup to my sewing machine and I would sew. I would sew from, this is the bottom, but I want all of my color fabrics to line up if possible. So I would take my cutting board, my tray, or whatever you put on your fabric on, and take that to your sewing machine and you would sew. This would go through your top of your, this is how you would feed it through your sewing machine. You would take this second piece, line it up, sew this seam. After you do that, take this piece, line it up, sew that seam. Take this next piece, flip it over, sew that seam. Take this final piece, flip it over, sew this seam. You would use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you could either press your seams open, or you could press your seams toward whatever fabric is darkest. When it comes to the top here, this is all white, so it doesn't really matter. So at that point, that is a style preference. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and show you exactly what I'm going to do. So here are the first two fabrics. I'm going to turn the gold fabric over to face the gray. I'm going to line them up. I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance. My 1/4 inch presser foot has a guide. So I'm going to lower my presser foot, lower my needle, just back stitch twice, and then I'm going to sew this seam. I'm using a 2.0 millimeter stitch length. I like to use that for my quilt construction. And right here, here's a seam from the strip piecing. So I'm going to hold it flat so that it stays towards the dark. The bottom strip is shorter than the top strip, so I can stop sewing right here, because once I finish all of my strips, I will square it up with my ruler. So here's our third strip. I take the third strip, place it on the second strip, and if the bottoms are not perfect, I will square that up later. Lower my presser foot, lower my needle, back stitch, and then sew my 1/4 inch seam. Once again, there's the seam from the strip piecing, and I have to be mindful of this seam right here. Make sure it's still pressed towards the dark, and continue to sew. That's the end of the strip. So I will cut my thread, lift my presser foot. And that's how I would do all of my strips for each block. And once I get to the point that I have 12 or 13 or so inches, then I would stop, and then I would move on to my next block. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Our next video, we will have all our blocks sewed together. We will have our seams pressed, and we will start arranging all of our blocks so that we can sew our rows together.